This past June, I got to return from my 10th trip to Ghana, West Africa, and it blows my mind that I've had the brilliant privilege and opportunity to be able to do that as part of the mission and ministry that God's called me to do. Every year I go, I learn something. I learn something about myself, I learn something about God's work, and I learn something about the world. Now, there was this one year a few years ago, and it was tough. Ghana is one of the countries that has two seasons. They have a rainy season and a dry season. Typically, the rainy season is from about May until about November. And it rains every day. Everything is green and lush and beautiful and kind of tropical. But then in November, the rains, they just stop, and it stays dry until the next circle and when it starts to rain again in May. Now, this year that we were there in June, and the rains hadn't come. So what people do is during the rainy season, they farm and they save up all their food, and then they enjoy that food through the dry season. But then there comes a time when the food runs out, when they don't have any more food, and they call, before the rains come again, and they call that period of time their hunger time. It's a time when they don't have any food and they're waiting for God to provide the rain again. Now, because of things that are beyond their control, the weather patterns are changing, and that time lasted well into June that year. As we entered this village, you could tell that people were hot and irritated and had these empty bellies, and that it was a frustrating experience. The Harmattan winds that come over the Saharan desert were coating everything in like this silty, sandy kind of muck that was on your skin just from walking around. We went and visited a chief in the village, and we sat down and greeted him and told him we were going to give out some mosquito nets and some other things. But then the chief looked at me and said, Pastor Angie, I have a question. He said, what is it like during your hunger time? I thought, hunger? I ate a protein bar in the car on my way here. I don't know that I've ever had a hunger time. It's my same question for you as we wrestle with this next chapter. What is it like during your hunger time? Now, we don't really have hunger times in our culture, do we? We all know, though, even though we aren't physically hungry, a lot of us aren't, we do have times in our lives when we hunger for something. We hunger for security or healing or loved or being seen or wanted, or we hunger for worth and value. We all have some kind of longing that we have in our hearts. In this chapter of the book of Mark, Jesus and his disciples, they've been really busy, and what they're longing for is a little time kind of on their own. Jesus did all this healing, and now it's time for them to go and take some time on their own. So they go and they walk out to a secluded place so that they can rest. The problem is that Jesus has built a name for himself, and these people are all following this huge crowd. The book of Mark says that it's 5,000 people plus women and children, but we're going to count the women and children. So let's be honest, it's something more like 20,000 people following Jesus out into the desert. And then it gets to be dinner time, and I'm sure it was hot in the Middle East at dinner time out in the desert. And this is what this says. The disciples came to Jesus and said, this is a remote place, they said, and it's already very late. Send the people away so that they can go to the surrounding communities and villages and buy themselves something to eat. But then Jesus looks at his disciples and he says to them, will you give them something to eat? Now, what I think is so interesting about this story is that this is the only miracle. We call it the feeding of the 5,000 plus women and children, so like 15, 20,000. This is the only story, only one of Jesus' miracles that is in all four of the Gospels, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. And I think that if something shows up in all four Gospels, it's like God putting up a big flashing sign like, hey, I want you to pay attention. There's something really big going on here. Jesus says, you give them something to eat. He looks at his disciples and he says, you're responsible for their hunger time. You give them something to eat. You fill their bellies. It is up to you. It is up to you to provide for their hunger. It is up for you to make sure that they are taken care of. It's up to you to give. Jesus says, you give them something to eat. You see, I think in this part and the fact that it's in all four Gospels, God is saying something about God's vision for the world, about how it is that we get through this human life, how we get through these hunger times, that it's clear about how we are filled up. It's us. We give them something to eat. But the disciples, they look at Jesus probably like he was crazy. And they say to Jesus, well, that would take more than half a year's wages. Are we to go spend that much on bread and then just give it so that everyone just has a bite? And Jesus looks at him and says, well, how many loaves do you have? He said, go and see. So they went out to the crowd and they came back and they said, well, we have 5 loaves of bread and 2 fish. Friends, it doesn't seem like enough. It doesn't seem like enough. Don't we do that too? We think that we can't give because it won't cover whatever we're experiencing in our longing, whatever we're experiencing in our hunger time. So we hold those things so very, very tightly. A friend of mine in Ghana, one time when she was up in a northern village, there was a girl who had been orphaned and abandoned. Her parents had died, and she's about 10 years old, and she made her way just by begging for food from neighbors and people, and really kind of isolated and living alone. And my friend, she took pity and compassion on this girl, and so she adopted her, and she took her into her own home back in the nation's capital of Accra. But the problem is that once she got her daughter into school, this little girl kept stealing food from all the other kids and from the cafeteria. She'd get phone call day after day after day. She'd sit down with her girl and she'd explain that there was going to be enough food for them, that there was going to be enough food for tomorrow, that there was always going to be plenty. But you see, for this little girl, she was so afraid that she wasn't going to have enough. My grandmother, she was born in 1919, and in 1929, when she was just 10 years old, was the Great Depression. She grew up and she can remember stories about having to keep food for all 7 people in her family, how they had to make it spread really, really far. And as she grew up and made some money as the economy came back, she still kept things. She's kept $10 bills and books, and she kept money tucked away underneath the bed. It's like she lived the rest of her life thinking that there maybe wasn't going to be enough. And I think we do this too. Like, if we're really, really honest with ourselves, we hold things tight because we fear that if we don't hold it tight, that there's not going to be enough. We hold back our love in fear that if we put our hearts out there, that we'll be hurt. Or we hold back our finances in fear that if we give, then we won't have enough. Or we even hold back like our teenagers in fear that they're going to go and make the same mistakes that we did when we were young. So we hold them back because it doesn't seem like we can protect them enough. It doesn't seem like enough. But when these disciples, they go and they get these 5 loaves of bread and these 2 fish, Jesus tells them to start giving it out. Give it out to these 15,000, 20,000 people, piece by piece, piece by piece. And then the book of Mark says they all ate and were satisfied. And the disciples picked up 12 basketfuls of broken pieces of bread and fish. My friends, with Jesus, when all is given out, there are leftovers. So what about your hunger time? I think Jesus looks at us and says, okay, well, what have you got? You got a little bit of bread, got a little bit of love to give, got a little bit of grace to give out to the world, got a couple of words of encouragement or some pocket change. Do you have a listening ear? Maybe you've got some leadership skills. Maybe all you can do is just pray. What have you got? Just your beautiful, messy self? I think Jesus says to us then, okay, let's roll up our sleeves. Let's do this, because together with Jesus, there's always more than enough. There's even leftovers. So here's my question for you today. Number 1, what are you hungry for? What are you in a hunger time for? What is your longing? And number 2, what resources do you maybe hold back for fear that they're not enough? We'll see you tomorrow.